the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the new episode of the Fact series in which we discuss international political matters every week. This is Foad Mahdavi, and in this episode, I have the honor of being the host of Max Parry, a journalist and writer from the US. We are here to discuss racism in the United States. Thank you for joining us, Max, and good to be with you. Let's get started with the term of racism. It seems that the racism is tied to American history. What do you think is the root of this sort of behavior on behalf of the U.S. administration?
Well, racism is at the very roots and foundation of the United States itself, going back all the way back to the colonists committing ethnic cleansing on a scale never before seen in history against Native Americans, and of course the use of slavery, which was the backbone of the U.S. economy for over a century. And so the United States was essentially founded on genocide and slavery. So racism is at the very root of the foundation of the United States. And also the legal documents, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, implicitly disappeared any people that lived here that were not landowning, wealthy white men. The documents that are the basis for American democracy today, when they were composed, there was an implicit social contract that excluded them from being able to have those rights. So that's at the very core of the foundation of this country. And so what we see happening today is there's still an inherited legacy of that. And as far as the issue of police brutality goes, the political scientist Michael Parenti said that the function of police is not to fight crime, but really for social control and to protect private property. And I believe that applies especially to police here in the United States, which in order to understand, we need to understand the way that modern policing developed historically. And actually the form of policing you have now is actually not as old as one might think. In France in the 1700s is actually where the current form of police originated. Obviously the concept of policing has existed for a long time, but the way that policing in the United States and in other countries occurs now is actually not such an old development historically. Before industrialization in Europe, the local law was actually enforced by volunteer watchmen. They were called the night watchmen, except for, in bigger cities, or like in Imperial Rome, where they would actually have the army enforce the law. But, essentially, most towns and cities did not expect it to come from the state level. It was locally, law was locally enforced. So it was more like community policing with watch groups. That was until the form of modern policing we have now took over, which was really in France with their policing model with the gendarme, where instead of policing being done locally, it began to come from the top down, and as an apparatus of state authority and state power, an instrument of state power. So in the United States, with the abolition of slavery, the need to criminalize the freed slaves in order to, the United States still needed their bodies, and so the 13th Amendment had a clause that slavery was illegal except in cases where one has committed a crime. So the need for law enforcement to criminalize black people in order to still get the economic production out of the workforce through a slave economy, the prison system became the mode of doing that. And, over a period of decades, we saw the rise of Jim Crow and segregation and the civil rights movement. And while some gains have been made, there's still brutal practices by law enforcement against black people. And since the 70s, with the rise of mass incarceration after the war on drugs and, the so-called war on crime, the United States prison population has risen, to more than a quarter of the world's prison population. But the United States is not the top most populous country in the world. We're behind countries like India and China, which have much bigger populations. But yet we have the largest prison population, and that's because of the rise of mass incarceration and now private prisons. And so in order to understand the racism going on today in the United States, we have to look at it historically. It can't be understood as, something happening in a vacuum. It's part of a lineage. And, I would also note that police departments in the United States have also been receiving lots of training from the Israeli Defense Forces, who are no strangers to systematic racism. And I would not be surprised to find out that the Minnesota Police Department, where this unjust killing of a black man, I would not be surprised to find out if Minnesota, the Minneapolis Police Department was one of those departments that got exchange training with the IDF.
How do Americans see racism? Actually, did they see racism as a big problem for American society, or do they agree with the government's approach?
Well, I think that, in the United States, the two major political parties have really kind of taken advantage of the divide, and have sort of commandeered it for their own political gain. And unfortunately, the topic of racism always sort of gets reduced in the United States into this sort of two-party culture war, rather than it being really connected to, the system of capitalism. And instead, it's reduced to this sort of like team sport of scoring political goals against one party against the other. And the Republican Party, obviously, they're preoccupied with dog whistling and appealing to the racism of whites. Starting back in 1968 with the Southern strategy that got Richard Nixon elected president, and that was to directly appeal to working class whites, who actually previously in the South, there had been the Dixiecrats. The Democratic Party was actually, the big political force in the South, but all that changed in 1968 when Richard Nixon ran on, these dog whistling, implicitly racist political slogans like we're going to fight a war on crime, we're going to fight a war on drugs, which was really code for, we're going to use state power to criminalize, crime, which they blamed on the civil rights movement, and also, the anti-war movement. And after Nixon was able to flip states in the South that had previously been Democratic and pulled working class whites by appealing to their prejudices. And in the decades since, we've seen the rise of mass incarceration, and that was expedited by the 1994 crime bill. The prison population has gone from a couple 100,000 in the 70s to now over 2 million, I believe. And even though African Americans are only 6% of the U.S. population, they're 40% of the demographic of the U.S. prison population. So, and Donald Trump is sort of an apotheosis of what Richard Nixon started back in 1968, arguably. And on the other hand, you have the Democratic Party, which, it has really, over the last several decades, gone back on being any kind of alternative to the Republican Party, including in terms of race. Namely, during the 1980s, they suffered huge defeats to Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. And their way of getting back into power was Bill Clinton in 1992 ran on a tough on crime platform. He simply adapted to the way that Republicans had political success. And his administration was arguably even tougher on the African American community, because not only did he sign the 1994 crime bill, but he also did away with a lot of the welfare state, which is another problem, because as these decades have seen the increase in the prison industrial complex, there's been a massive slow undoing of the U.S. welfare state. What Roosevelt began with the New Deal, then also the Johnson administration with the Great Society. So both political parties are really part of the problem, and unfortunately, the topic of racism, the sort of national discussion about it, it's always framed within very narrow parameters rather than having any kind of systematic or historical understanding about it. And, I think these events, like we've seen this week in the United States, is sort of the situation just boiling over. But I don't think either political party really has an answer to it. And in fact, both are very much part of the problem. I mean, even Obama, signed in 2015, after the killing of 2 police officers in Brooklyn, New York, signed the Blue Alert Law, which further protected law enforcement in terms of having immunity and abusing their power. So, both political parties are really a part of the problem, and they are very much in charge of controlling the narrative as far as how racism is discussed in the United States.
What is the main category of this racist approach of the U.S. government? Do they only include blacks, or there are other categories?
Well, white supremacy is really the root of the U.S. government, not just at home, but really abroad. And I think that what we see happening domestically is an inversion of what the rest of the world experiences at the hands of U.S. imperialism abroad. What has the United States done the last century? It's extended its hegemonic power, treating the world like it can do whatever it wants, with more than 800 military bases around the globe. It spends more than $800 billion every year on defense. It's been spent the last 2 decades essentially establishing its own major colonies in the Middle East. It's been arming and fighting proxy wars against its enemies, who are always, nations that won't play ball with U.S. imperialism, countries that dare stand up to the United States. So it's by no means limited to just domestically. That, in fact, I think what occurs here, including also just gun violence in general. It's with something like the mass shooting phenomenon. I think in order to understand something like that, it's no coincidence that the country that spends the most on defense and on military power also would have a unique problem of domestic mass shootings. I think that those issues are entirely related. And I would say the same thing about racism domestically, that the country that goes around the world overthrowing governments it doesn't like because it won't institute policies that it dictates, that it's no coincidence that it would have, if it's subjugating countries in Latin America and the Middle East, Africa, and other places under its boot, it's going to have the same problem domestically, where it's treating communities of color, racial minorities, the poor. It would be treating them the same way. I think it's all connected in that way.
It has been reported that blacks were more affected by the outbreak of the coronavirus in the United States, and that the mortality rate in this group was higher than in others. What do you think is the reason for this tragedy?
Well, I mean, people who are living in lower income areas, areas where the population is denser, or who are doing jobs deemed essential work, which have we can see now are so taken for granted. Now only after this pandemic they're being called essential work, but they always were essential work. This is what workers' labor power is what drives the economy, not speculations on Wall Street. The people that are doing those jobs are having, while everyone else is staying inside under these lockdowns, they're on the front lines. Their lives are at risk. Their health is at risk. Unfortunately, because of systemic racism and because of class and income disparity in the United States, a great number of those people, a very large percentage, are communities of color. So in the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, they've been impacted significantly and disproportionately because they are on the front lines, because they are having to do these jobs where their health and lives are at risk. And it's just yet another example of racism in the United States. And the response by the U.S. government has been an absolute joke. I mean, they've been bailing out entire corporate industries like the cruise industry and the airline industry and other industries affected by the coronavirus, but throwing breadcrumbs to the average worker in the United States. These very small, insufficient stimulus checks, direct payments, which is only going to alleviate the very short-term effects of the economic impact of the virus. But we've seen massive layoffs, over 30 million, and so many people in the United States, because there's no national healthcare system, they're also dependent on being employed for their healthcare. So not only are you having tens of millions of people being laid off in their job, but also they are losing their health insurance with that. Their health insurance in the middle of a global health crisis. So it's no wonder in the United States you see the numbers versus other countries, including those with much bigger populations like China and India. You've seen the United States have an astronomically higher case rate and especially death rate, mortality rate, just exceeded over 100,000. And so, of course, there's other factors involved with that, namely not having a preventative healthcare system means that the U.S. also has a lot of pre-existing respiratory illnesses, but a huge major portion of that is also not having a national healthcare system as well. And so, the COVID-19 pandemic is just heightening all the inherent contradictions of life in the United States. And of course, racism is one of them. And so the way that the virus is affecting all groups that are already suffering the most under a failing political and economic system, all those contradictions are going to be even greater increased during a global health crisis like the pandemic.
Thanks for joining us again, and I do appreciate due to your noteworthy remarks, and I hope things are going well with your work. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Take care.
Dear audience, it was another talk with Max Parry, journalist and writer from the US, about racism in the United States. Thanks for watching and catch you later.